Hello everyone, greetings from the 7th of Nero, AJ here, with the continuation of the events in Immoren that covers the latter half of the main War Machine and Hordes game's storyline prior to the arrival of the Infernals. I'm still working on the narrative for that take and incorporating the time skip and figuring out how to work around the lack of fine detail of the setting in the Requiem phase of the timeline. And that explains why the next video after this one will be a bit different. Relevant to this episode, it was pretty much the same experience as the last one, except this time it was nice to remember the stories I first read when I started the game, regaled by an old Legion playing friend, and I started playing War Machine and Hordes just after the release of Colossals. Narn and Nail being my first purchases in the game, while a box containing Hyperion above the racks of Retribution Warcasters and Solos taunted me for a few months before I bought it shortly after Vengeance was released. Anyway, enough story time about me, proper story time now. Alliances, or even formal diplomacy, were a thing of the past now that all nations had their own goals, struggles and agendas. In Lael, the resistance, often taking on motley bands of mercenaries from Ord or wherever else the displaced nobles could find them, struggled against both Khadorans, who claimed half their country, and the Protectorate, who tried to claim the other half. And yet here, so far inland, Crixtian incursions reached, for Lich Lord Terminus was reported to lead his undead host here. At Ridden, one of the last bastions of Laeli's freedom, his arrival interrupted a skirmish between the forces of Exemplars and Steelheads. The warring humans, knowing that the armies of the Necromancers were a greater threat to both, chose to settle their scores at a later date. The other major incursion at Point Bourne had thrown the conflict between Khador and Cygnar into a similar turmoil, with the two human nations' commanders willing to fight each other almost as much as the Crixians. The Thornwood had turned into a maelstrom of a contested region, with Khador and Cygnar wishing to hold it and its resources within their borders, while the peoples that lived there bridled against both, to the extent that the denizens of the Blindwater Lake inexorably coalesced around an ancient shaman among their number, one who had more than mere pretensions to godhood. And yet, the undead were not the only trouble that the Protectorate had as well, for the Northern Crusade, in their fighting around Ridden, had ventured too close to the southwestern reaches of the Mistval, and their marching forces brought them within a stone's throw of the Gate of Mists. The Laelese, already cautious around their reticent neighbours, knew better than to test the Iosan borders, and because they were already abroad for the impending return of Nisor, the Retribution was not willing to take any additional risks concerning the safety of their god, and skirmishing took place between the two groups of zealots. To the north, the conflict between the shadowy Circle Orboros and the Trollbloods continued, though now with the blighted minions of Everblight thrown in. The more traditional northern Trollkin, under the charismatic shaman Borka Kingslayer, sought to unite with their southern brethren, whose society was evolving with their human counterparts, even if out of necessity more than desire. The Northkin were troubled by the machinations of the Circle Orboros, just as the southern Creoles had been. And one notable event was the duel between Borka and Cromac, a Tharn chieftain almost unique in his primal magic. There was no negotiating between them, but worse yet, as the numerous wars of mankind wore on, all Trollkin began to feel increasingly slighted by Cygnar's conduct across the Creel territories. And the Trollkin of the Gnarls, riled up by the reactionary shaman Doomshaper, planned an assault against Serral, amongst other cities. With so many fronts of war opened up, and battle lines that had not moved for some time, even if that is a relative consideration here, internal divisions appeared among the various powers that were invested in these wars. Fractures were opening up everywhere among nominal allies. The various nobles of Lael vied for personal interests more than the sovereignty of their nation. In Khador, Erisk faced criticisms by both his empress and his rivals at court. Factions appeared within the Protectorate, and only the force of Severus's will and belief kept the forces of the Crusades together. Even among the Crixians, the Lich Lords regarded each other with growing disdain, especially towards Asphyxius's seemingly unlimited ambitions. Indeed, some months before, without consulting his peers, he had contacted the elusive Cephalix, gaining allies of convenience. Thanks to this and successive talks, a long-hidden rivalry came to the fore between those who wished to call themselves beyond human. One by enhancing the flesh, and the other by replacing it entirely, resuming a centuries-long enmity between the Cephalix and the Cyruses of the cults called the Convergence. That extended as far as personal vendettas among the leaders of their respective hierarchies, as well as a self-made Lich defector who served as Asphyxius's artificer in the necrofactoriums underneath the Thornwood. The Lich Lord, though, was hampered by the interference of those that vied for this region, particularly the Grey Lord Covenant, who sought the same arcane resources that the Crixians did, just as others fought for control of the surface. It was only a matter of time before this status quo would be shaken at its foundation as well, like every one that came before. Colossals, something that had not been seen in Immoren for more than 300 years, were the chosen weapon to break the deadlock of the many wars among the Iron Kingdoms. Cygnar started fielding them first in the form of the Stormwall, or so they thought. The Khadorans and Protectorate had plans for such weapons at much the same time as their rivals, while within the Iosan armory, the Hyperion was developed as a response to Everblight's assault on Ysera more than 200 years before, a weapon that could contend with the dragons without the sacrifice of a whole city. And legends of the Cryxian Kraken had circulated along the coasts of Cygnar and Ord since almost as far back as the days of the Orgoth defeat, though it is still an unsubstantiated rumour that the sea creature from whom it derives its name and this abomination that is a product of Cryx's most depraved necrotects are the same. And among some of the other nations, they had comparable weapons already. A Scorn Mammoth had participated in the assault on Corvus, while the kings of the Trollbloods had recently been awoken from their long slumber by one of the few shamans capable of controlling them. Even the clans of Rule, more given to industry and their technology, adapted their greatest mining machines to compete with their southern rivals, as opposed to simply each other, not to be left behind by such an arms race. Everblight had plans of his own such weapon. With knowledge of Pyromalfic's location and his weakness, the Legion and its dragonspawn were dispatched south towards the Castle of Keys. Though the dragon struggled against his assailants, he was eventually destroyed, and under Everblight's guidance, Pyromalfic's remains were put to horrifying use, while Everblight himself consumed the dead dragon's essence. For as to the flesh of the now dead dragon, aided by Everblight's warlocks, it was reformed into the idealized form of dragonspawn, the Archangel. At the time it was feared that with this weapon the dragon would seek to openly defy his brother dragons and challenge Torok himself. Indeed, amidst the struggles of the mortal races and their efforts to find ever stronger weapons to gain an edge on their enemies, whatever the cost, the conflict amongst the dragons resumed. The Athank of Nidoboros, sealed away after his defeat by Torok almost 2 millennia before, was unearthed by Lich Lord Venethrax and subsequently sought by everyone within reach of it. As he attempted to bring it back to Skell, the Athank was lost to a Cygnaran detachment, and according to hearsay concerning the activity of the druids of the Circle Lorboros, one among their number persuaded the Draconic alliance under Blightagast to turn upon the growing threat of Everblight, as well as ensuring that the Dragonfather remained away from the Immerese mainland. But before this scheme could be seen to fruition, the dragons assembled once more to confront the Lord of Cryx, and though Torok left his progeny weakened in the ensuing fight, ultimately those who held custody of the Athank conveyed it to Blightagast, so that the Dragonfather would not gain supremacy over the other dragons. Curiously, among those who agreed to grant this power to the leader of the Draconic Alliance were sibling warlocks under Everblight, though I neither know nor understand the means by which they hid their minds from their master. Similarly, Gorshade had been following Nisor on the god's journey back to Ios through Khador and Lael, though none among the Cryxians knew of his plans or intentions, it seems, for he arrived at the border between his former nation and Rule almost entirely without incident, and though he managed to infiltrate the Fane of Sheer, where Syra rested, neither his fate nor those of his gods were what any of us expected. Instead of being destroyed, as many Iosans believed should have happened, and instead of killing our gods, as the Eldritch desired, he was purified, one may express, by what strength Syra had left, brought back to the living, both mind and soul. He ignored the fact that many reverent zealots referred to him as Gearshield the Forgiven, and fought as a commander of the Retribution in the struggle against the Scorn. For just as Nisor was restored to Elven lands, the Eastern Empire attacked through the Twilight Gate in the south, with secondary attacks further to the north as well, particularly at Aerith Dawnguard. It was under the cover of this invasion that Gorshade returned, but with his restoration to life, the Scorn advance into the Mistbal was brought to a halt, and the two sides settled into an uncomfortable pattern of skirmishes. Elsewhere, and somewhat tangential to Scorn interests, despite being a fugitive from both Cygnar and Scorn, Vinter Relthorn never relinquished his desire to reclaim his former throne. But what few allies that he had dwindled, and though he made one last effort with the help of a small number of loyal and ambitious Cygnaran nobles, he was defeated by the defection of what was once one of his most loyal lieutenants, Asheth Magnus. The long-time mercenary discovered Vinter's bastard, Julius, and with an army at his back sought to put the then youth on the throne. He and the king whose rule he denied made an agreement to defeat Vinter once and for all, and that Julius would become king with his uncle Leto as his advisor until he reached his majority. And just as Cygnar's royal line struggled to retain some semblance of stability, the Khadorans had not been idle during the strained peace that had been agreed concerning control of Lael, despite the continuing battles at other fronts for which separate treaties were eventually drawn up. In the aftermath of the invasion, what remained of the de la Martin family fled into hiding, but many were still discovered by treacherous nobles, Khadoran agents from Section 3, or turncoat mercenary commanders who sought bounty in some form or other. The peace agreed by Julius in one of his first official acts as king was to recognise Khadoran sovereignty over Umbrian Lael on the basis that there were no longer any successors of the last king, Renard. Thus, all possible claimants were killed to serve the Khadoran goal of ensuring that no potential heir could put forward their claim and challenge the integrity of the empire. Except one did survive, Kaetlyn, a daughter of a cadet branch of the former ruling line, but with undeniable legitimacy as an heir to the Laelese throne. She was discovered and secreted to Caspia for her protection, and when she was unveiled, proposed as the future wife of Julius, renewed war seemed inevitable between Khador and Cygnar, given Ain and her government's presumed refusal to respect any claim to Lael's crown, legitimate or otherwise. And it seemed that colossals would not be enough to see either side a winner in this latest round of conflict. Instead, under the strictest veil of secrecy, both sides had been developing an even more fearsome weapon. Cygnar so that they would be able to defend themselves from the capricious dragons, of godly power but unpredictable temperament, while Khador knew that anything their southern neighbour did, they had to at least equal. Thus were unleashed upon Immoren their skyships, titanic constructs comparable in size to battleships of the seas. The Stormbreaker, the Khadoran flagship, turned into the latest battlefield itself between the two belligerents as both sides sought to cripple the other's skyships. At great cost, the Cygnarans brought down their northern enemies' skyships, one of them in the first ever airborne action in Imre's history that did not feature dragons. There was, however, little chance to think of peace in the aftermath. But perhaps of the greatest impact to the Iron Kingdoms, Immoren and its peoples, greater than even the wars among dragonkind, debatable though this may be, was the Wicked Harvest, a name from where I do not know, whether who named it so, when or why. Before the coming of the Hermit of Hengehold, none but the most senior Menite lawkeepers, I suspect, knew the reason or means by which the Grimkin would arrive on Caen, led by the Defiers. Neither I nor my peers had given much credence to the Khadoran stories about the Old Witch or the urban legends concerning the fey creatures that stalked the nightmares of humans, but it seemed that there was far more than a mere grain of truth in these legends and rumours, for the Old Witch had a guiding hand in bringing these denizens of Caen to our dimension, in the years before the skyship war between Cygnar and Khador. These manifestations of the figments of human dreams, their fears, and repressed memories, came as a scourge on those that were considered suitable for judgment by the Defiers. Little did anyone know at the time, though, including the Old Witch herself, that her actions would accelerate the coming of an even greater threat, the very same that she wished to forestall. This same threat forced aside the many enmities among the peoples of Immoren, perhaps especially among the human nations, who had spent so long fighting each other, though it would affect everyone, almost without exception, and whether they wished it or not.